Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Bart Sibrel is considered by many people to be a leading voice in claims that the Apollo moon landings were faked. He's produced several films, published books and released many YouTube videos surrounding this claimed conspiracy. Now, I personally have already done some videos in the past tackling his claims and showing how they're wrong, but recently Bart appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast, where they spent more than 3 hours discussing the moon landings and other conspiracies. So in this video, I'll aim to dissect his misinformation. There's a lot to get through. Like I said, they were talking for more than 3 hours, although there were quite a few repeats of claims and not everything they said was directly related to the moon landings. So here is a breakdown of the topics and timestamps that I'll be going over everything, and I'm going to start with Bart's main claim. What he talks about most, and he has said this was the one thing that first made him believe that the moon landings were faked.
Well, on the left, Neil Armstrong claims this is 130,000 miles out. He claims that the camera lens is at the glass, and that's the Earth floating in space. What's on the right-hand side are the outtakes that we got an unedited reel of the special effects shot by accident.
Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day.
So the basics of it is that Apollo 11 apparently isn't 130,000 miles away from Earth, zooming in on the whole thing, but is instead only a few hundred miles away in low Earth orbit, and the command module window has been covered up, apart from a small circular cutout, to create the impression that the Earth is just a small circle in the frame.
On the left, he claims, and this is the part they showed to the public, that that's the Earth floating in space halfway to the moon looking back. Okay. And then on the right is the outtakes where the lights come up and you see that the camera's really at the back of the spacecraft, and that's part of the Earth outside of a circular window.
They're using the darkness of the cabin by blocking out all the windows, and it makes it look like it's space.
Exactly. It makes it look like the Earth is floating in space. So we have them faking being halfway to the moon, which means they cannot go.
So this is his big claim. He openly accepts that the astronauts are in space, but he says that they're staying in low Earth orbit and faking the appearance of the Earth being really far away by shooting out of a circular window. And he says they had to do this because they couldn't really get beyond low Earth orbit due to the Van Allen belts, which we'll get onto shortly. Now, I've already done a video addressing this several months ago, which I'll link up here if you want to check it out later, but the short and sweet version of how we know that this Apollo 11 footage can't have been in low Earth orbit is if you look at any piece of footage that was taken in low Earth orbit, we can see because the spacecrafts are so close to Earth, they're moving very quickly above its surface, and so the clouds are constantly moving past the camera. The Apollo 9 EVA actually gives us a perfect demonstration of exactly how the Earth would look if we were looking at it through a circular cutout window from low Earth orbit. And it looks nothing like the Earth we see in Apollo 11's broadcasts. In that broadcast, we see an uninterrupted view of the Earth for the best part of 10 minutes, and the clouds don't change. At the end of that broadcast, some 20 minutes later, they then go back to the window and view the Earth again, and not only are the clouds all still in the same position, the whole Earth has rotated slightly. I'll just put that in to cover off any potential claims that they're just shooting a photo of the Earth stuck to the window.
Which is another lie, that there's only one window that faces the Earth and it's filled up with the TV camera, meaning the lens would have to be right up against the window to see that. But the camera's really at the back of the spacecraft with all the lights off.
Let's play that.
You're seeing part of the Earth outside of the window. It's very ingenious.
So Bart's arguing that they claim the camera was right next to the window viewing the Earth, but then when the image is brightened up from them opening up the camera iris, you can see that the camera's not next to the window, it's on the opposite side of the spacecraft. So he's claiming that the camera was never near the window, that they just had the camera across the spacecraft zoomed in on a circular window to give a cutout view of Earth, and then as they zoom the camera out, you see the cabin light appear. Except when zooming out, the Earth would also appear smaller as well. If you look at what happens in the broadcast, the Earth shrinks as the camera zooms out, but the cabin light isn't in view until several seconds afterwards. Because what's actually happening is the first couple of minutes of the broadcast are showing the Earth and they have the camera next to the window, and then Mission Control asks if they could see the astronauts as well.
If you could comply, we'd like to see some smiling faces up there. If you could give us some interior views, I'm sure everybody'd like to see you. Over.
So they first zoom the camera out to get a wider field of view. This makes the Earth shrink. Then they move the camera away from the window and across to the other side of the craft in order to get a clearer view of the people inside. This is where the light becomes visible. And then they open up the iris to let more light in, which makes the image brighter.
Apollo 11, Houston, appears to us that we're seeing a view from outside plus a little of the inside. It appears you've taken the camera away from the left window. Now, over. That's correct. We're moving it back and reconfiguring for interior lighting. Roger.
Bart's claim even hinges on the notion that they're viewing through a circular window with a cutout put in place to create a Terminator line.
And that's part of the Earth outside of a circular window with a little crescent piece molded in front of it.
Except the only circular window on the command module was the one on the inside of the hatch, which is above the seats. The window that we are seeing in this footage is a square one next to the left-hand seat. And Bart also refers to Apollo 11 having done other broadcasts which weren't televised to the public at the time, and claiming these were done to perfect the techniques needed to create the deception of being halfway to the moon.
Space. What's on the right-hand side are the outtakes that we got an unedited reel of the special effects shot by accident.
Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later. Subsequently, this take was never used.
Yes, Apollo 11 made several broadcasts back to Houston. Only the planned ones were televised, the unplanned ones generally weren't. Now, in the broadcasts that Bart likes to focus on, he makes quite a big deal about the fact that they talk about covering up the other windows, and Bart puts this down to them wanting to keep the cabin dark so that you can't see that they're lying about the position of the camera.
They're using the darkness of the cabin by blocking out all the windows, and it makes it look like it's space.
Exactly. It makes it look like the Earth is floating in space. So we have them faking being halfway to the moon, which means they cannot go.
The actual reason is far more straightforward. With the other windows uncovered, you've got the chance of getting reflections showing up on the inside of the window that they're trying to film through. I mean, just try it yourself. Take a photograph through a window at night from inside your house looking out, and you'll see reflections of the room, which isn't ideal for a TV broadcast. However, amongst the unplanned broadcasts, there were other ones that Bart doesn't reference. One, for example, which took place at 30 hours and 28 minutes into the mission, a few hours prior to the broadcasts that Bart does refer to. In this broadcast, we can see that all of the windows are uncovered, so there's a lot of light getting into the cabin, and that they again show a view of the Earth out of the window, but this time the window frame is clearly visible. It's not circular and it's got no cutouts in place. The camera is clearly right next to it rather than on the other side of the craft, and the Earth is not filling up the window, which it would be doing if they were in low Earth orbit, making it blindingly obvious that this footage can't have possibly have been in low Earth orbit and instead must have been thousands of miles away, which would put them beyond the Van Allen belts. That destroys the linchpin of Bart's whole argument, because all his focus is that the moon landings must have been faked because they couldn't physically go beyond the Van Allen belts. Also, his argument doesn't really make any sense because he's saying that they needed to do these unscheduled broadcasts to perfect everything ready for the main televised broadcast. Except Apollo 10 a few months previously did a dress rehearsal run all the way to the moon. Not only did they show us the Earth out of the window, but they then spun the camera round to the opposite window to show us the moon, and showing that the moon was bigger than the Earth. So they must have been closer to the moon than they were to the Earth. If they'd faked all of that on Apollo 10, they would have already known how to have faked it all for Apollo 11. They wouldn't have needed the unscheduled broadcasts. All of that right there should really end this video, because it completely pulls the rug out of Bart's whole premise. However, all of those points that I've just made were laid out clearly in the video that I published 7 months ago. And 6 months ago, Bart himself commented on that very video. So, he's already clearly seen the points debunking all of those claims, and yet he's made no attempt to actually address them, and here he is, months later, still regurgitating the same claims on Joe Rogan's show. Even when Joe gifts him a plausible alternative, saying, well, maybe they did go to the moon, but that they'd had to fake the photos.
Okay, well,
right.
Why would the pictures be fake if they really went? But
well,
in any case,
you could make the argument that the radiation damaged the cameras and they weren't able to get real photographs, and so they made a conscious decision to use fake photographs. Or publicity firms that work for NASA had a limited amount of photos to work with, and they decided to manipulate some so that they could have photos that they didn't have of an actual event which really took place, which was a spacewalk.
But what we have is them faking being halfway to the moon.
Right, but they do things like the spacewalk. They do things like the Space Center.
Well,
right?
they can't leave Earth orbit.
Bart doubles down with the claims that they could have never have made it that far from Earth.
If I were going around saying George Washington was not the first president, it was really Mickey Mouse, do you think there'd be 1,000 videos to reassure people that George Washington was the first president and not Mickey Mouse? But there's 1,000 videos out there that took tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours to produce to defend the moon landings. If it's so obvious, they should speak for themselves. It has to be continually supported because it's made out of straw. That's why.
Oh, this argument always makes me laugh. If the moon landings really happened, why do people still need to try and prove they did? To which my response is always, if the landings were so obviously fake, why do people need to push so hard to try and prove they were? Bart released his film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon back in 2001, and yet here he is 23 years later still making videos, writing books and appearing on shows, still trying to push the same claims. Why, if it was so obviously fake? Of course, the main reason why I make these videos isn't directly to try and convince people like Bart that the moon landings happened. It's to dispel the misinformation that gets blatantly spread by the likes of Bart, who is trying to convince people that it was fake. I hate misinformation, and if you do too, then you should check out today's sponsor, Ground News. There's so much bias and misinformation in the media these days, which is made worse by the fact that algorithms push what they think you want to see, which can further reinforce any potential bias. This is where Ground News aims to clear things up. They aren't a media outlet themselves, but rather a central hub for news outlets, and they use multiple independent news monitoring organisations in order to apply ratings to each article. For example, let's say I wanted to read up about the recent manned Blue Origin launch. If I just search for Blue Origin, it will show me any and all articles related to Blue Origin. The top section at the moment is obviously about the crewed launch, of which it's bringing up over 160 articles on that topic. It's showing more than half of the articles are central on the bias rating, 29% are to the left and 14% to the right. The bias comparison tool shows me how the left and right generally differ from each other in their coverage of this event. And under the factuality ratings, I can see that 79% of the articles are rated high for factuality and 21% are mixed. But Ground News doesn't hide any of these articles from you to try and sway your opinion. You can filter the articles down to any bias and level of factuality that you desire. The important thing with this, and which is why I like Ground News, is that you know what you're choosing. So if you're tired of being spoon-fed biased news and you want all of the information to be able to make informed decisions, then check out Ground News today. And if you use my link ground.news/DaveM, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan.
Well,
right?
they can't leave Earth orbit.
That's where it gets confusing.
Right.
So the real problem, the question is the Van Allen radiation belts.
These are areas of radiation surrounding Earth, and they're caused by particles in the sun's solar wind that get trapped in Earth's magnetic field. And funnily enough, I also happen to have done a video tackling this topic very recently as well, because it's one that a lot of people bring up as apparent proof that the landings must have been faked. And like most people, Bart focuses very heavily on things that were said in one of NASA's videos called Orion Trial by Fire.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Bart repeatedly nails down on this statement about before we send humans through this region of space.
When was Orion?
Well, he says you must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. He says we must first solve these challenges of radiation protection before we send people through this region of space.
Well, yeah, before sending humans in the Orion spacecraft through the region of space that is the radiation belt, then they need to overcome the challenge of ensuring that the spacecraft they've built and all of its systems can cope with it. They don't want to send crew through the radiation belt only to then find that the guidance systems get completely fried. NASA did the same thing with Apollo 4 and 6, which were both unmanned flights that, like the 2014 Orion flight, went into the Van Allen belt in order to test the radiation levels that would be experienced inside the command modules. And that was before humans ever attempted it. The Soviets had intended on using their Zond spacecraft for their manned moon missions, and in 1968 they sent Zond 5 unmanned around the moon, complete with tortoises, flies, worms and plants, as well as radiation sensors, in order to check the levels of radiation on board. And SpaceX will be sending an unmanned Starship to the moon before they try flying any manned missions up there as well. So it is not unusual for spacecraft to be sent through that region of space unmanned in order to overcome the challenge of making sure they've correctly built a spacecraft that can handle it without any problems. Just because a previous type of spacecraft managed to do it does not mean you can automatically assume that your new one is going to work perfectly. It would be like someone designing a brand new series of planes, or God forbid a nuclear reactor, and then thinking, well, the last ones we made worked fine, so no need to bother testing the new ones. In reality, the belts are nowhere near as death-ray deadly as Bart likes to portray. The outer Van Allen belt reaches out to around 60,000 kilometers. Geostationary satellites can only obtain a geostationary orbit when around 36,000 kilometers above the equator. So every geostationary satellite spends years just sitting in the radiation belt and they have no issues. And interestingly, many humans actually go through the inner belt quite regularly. The inner belt generally starts around 1,600 kilometers above Earth. However, there are areas stretching around South America called the South Atlantic Anomaly, where the Earth's magnetic field weakens, and this causes the inner belt to drop to only 200 kilometers above Earth. The International Space Station regularly passes through this region. You can actually see the radiation affecting the live camera feeds from on board it. And yet, some people have spent more than a year in total on board the space station. But even if the belts were as deadly as Bart likes to portray, as I covered in my recent video, they are still belts. They're not layers. Orbiting around the middle of them wouldn't be great, but Apollo's orbit was inclined relative to the belts, so they actually went through weaker regions. But if absolutely necessary, they could have gone into a polar orbit and gone completely above or below the belts, a point which Joe actually puts to Bart and which Bart gets spectacularly wrong.
Now, the people that say that it's easy to go through the Van Allen radiation belts will tell you that it's a donut. It's not like covering the entire sphere of Earth. that there's openings at the top and the bottom. Is this correct?
Well, yeah, but then they would have to launch at the North Pole or South Pole, where it's not possible to launch because of the temperatures.
That's the only way you could do it to get through those holes?
That's right. According to NASA's own flight plan, they went directly through the center. That's why they launched in southern Florida, to be close to the equator. According to NASA's own flight plan, they went directly through the center.
Sure, you can launch from the poles to get into a polar orbit, but it's not a necessity. A polar orbit is merely an orbit which runs over both poles. You can launch from anywhere in the world. As long as your rocket goes directly either north or south, you'll wind up in a polar orbit. Currently, there are at least 8 satellites in polar orbit around Earth. Metops A and B, which were both launched from Kazakhstan, and the other 6 were all launched from the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. None of them launched from the North or South Pole. So, Apollo missions could have avoided the belts altogether if necessary. The reason they didn't is because the closer you get to an equatorial aim, the less fuel you need because you're able to take more advantage of Earth's rotation. But likewise, they didn't launch into a perfectly equatorial orbit because that would have put them straight through the heart of the inner Van Allen belts. Bart also makes the pretty common argument about how come they could have got there 50 years ago with that technology, but we haven't been back since with newer technology.
So the number one proof that we have is simply deductive reasoning, because today, with 54-year better rocket designs and computer designs, the farthest that NASA can send a rocket with an astronaut into space is 1,000th the distance to the moon. When they first exploded the first atomic bomb, 1945, just 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So if they could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, we would have been on Mars 10 years later. We'd be in another solar system by now, and there would be bases all over the moon.
Personally, I find that argument to be quite narrow-minded as evidence of them faking it back in the 60s. The Apollo program launched 7 unmanned command modules into low Earth orbit, plus an additional 2 unmanned ones into the Van Allen belts before they ever put humans into orbit. Orion has only been into space twice, 1 unmanned going through the belts and 1 unmanned going around the moon. The next flight should be a manned mission around the moon. So NASA is on course to achieve in 3 launches what they needed 11 launches to do with Apollo. So it's not about what they're able to do. Is it about the cost? Many people point out how NASA's budget is now more than $20 billion per year, whereas at the peak of Apollo it was just under $6 billion per year. Except, adjusting for inflation, NASA in the 1960s were getting the equivalent of around $50 billion per year, so more than double what they're receiving now. In the mid-1960s, NASA received almost 5% of the entire federal budget. Nowadays, it's less than 0.5%. Plus, back in the 1960s, getting to the moon was NASA's only focus. Pretty much all their budget went into the Apollo program. Adjusted for inflation, the total cost of the Apollo program for the 13 years between 1960 to 1973 was $257 billion. The cost of the Artemis program for the 13 years from 2012 to 2025 is $93 billion. Well, the only other factor in this argument, comparing it to doing it with 1960s technology, is the time frame. Within 9 years of Apollo starting, they'd landed on the moon. Artemis, by comparison, was first established back in 2012, and currently it looks like it's aiming for landing humans on the moon in 2027, so 15 years. So is this their argument, that they're taking much longer with newer technology, so how could they have done it in that time frame with the older tech? Well, for example, a large typical warship takes 3 to 5 years to build. Back in 1906, the British battleship HMS Dreadnought was completed in 1 year and 1 day from start to finish. They can't do it that fast these days with newer technology, but that does not mean that Dreadnought was faked. Dreadnought was built that fast because it was so revolutionary that it was made an absolute priority. Everything else was put on hold and every available resource was pushed into getting that built. Nowadays, there's no such urgency. And it's a similar argument for the moon. There is far less urgency for people to go and do something that has already been done versus trying to do it for the first time. In the 1960s, NASA basically had unlimited resources. They were churning out launches left, right, and centre in a race to get to the moon first. During the 8-year period from 1961, when development of the Saturn rockets started, through to 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, NASA launched 21 Saturn rockets, plus the 7 Mercury and 12 Gemini rockets that were also launched during the same period, makes for a total of 40 launches in 8 years. Nowadays, they're on a much tighter financial leash. Imagine you're trying to build a house from scratch. If you had an endless bank balance, you could just pull in any and all contractors you wanted and throw enough cash at them to make sure that your house was the only project that they were focusing on. And you would get that house built a lot faster than if you were having to be frugal with your money. Then there's also the factor that, yes, they have newer technology, but they're also trying to do something very different than what they did with Apollo. Which, incidentally, links to something else Bart tried to take a pop at, when he says that von Braun originally stated that to get to the moon would need 3 rocket launches and would total a significantly higher weight than the Saturn V.
He also said in writing, in order to go to the moon in one rocket, he says that cannot happen. You need 3 rockets, each being 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons each, in order to go to the moon. And the Saturn V was 2,500 tons.
That was from his book, right? And what year was that?
I think that came out in 1959, and then he recanted on his math shortly thereafter by 30,000%.
And then follows this up by talking about Elon Musk saying that Starship will need 8 or 9 rockets to refuel in space.
And now Elon Musk wants to, quote, return to the moon. And he says to return to the moon, we need to make 9 fuel trips.
Now, regarding Starship, Apollo and Artemis are very different ideas. The Apollo Lunar Module was a 2-man craft that had a mass of just over 15,000 kilos, and more than half of that mass was fuel used for the descent. It was only able to support those 2 people for a few days, and it only used its fuel for the descent to the surface and then back up to lunar orbit. Whereas with Artemis, they will fly a crewed Orion capsule to dock with a Starship in lunar orbit. The Starship will then land on the moon, which will be able to support a larger crew for potentially weeks. Starship has a mass of over 1 million kilos. That's almost 100 times more than the Lunar Module. The Starship also has to use its own fuel from launch to get into orbit around Earth, so it then needs to be refueled in order to then get to the moon and descend to the surface and then back up again and potentially return to Earth. Now, with regards to von Braun's claims of rocket sizes, this for me is a prime example of Bart's attempts to deceive people. Because I fail to see how he could know so much about the Apollo program and supposedly have read von Braun's book and yet know nothing about the proposed methods that von Braun gave for getting to the moon. In the mid-1950s, von Braun was proposing having a 50-man space station in orbit around Earth.
To facilitate this refueling operation, we will establish an advanced base in the orbit, 1,000 miles above the Earth. This advanced base, or space station, will be headquarters for the final ascent to the moon. Our space satellite will have the shape of a wheel, measuring 200 feet across. Its outside rim will contain living and working quarters for a crew of 50 men.
They would construct a 4-person moon rocket at the space station and then launch that to the moon.
This model will show you how our future moon rocket ship might be designed. It will be 53 feet in length, has no wings or tail surfaces, because it will be assembled and operated only in the vacuum of space.
When the Apollo program started in 1961, von Braun had 2 methods he proposed. direct ascent, and Earth orbit rendezvous. Now, the TV series Earth to the Moon explains the differences in these perfectly.
The first method we call direct ascent. You build an enormous rocket, put a capsule on top, boom, you go straight to the moon. The other method we call Earth orbit rendezvous. Instead of using one huge rocket, we perform several launches with somewhat smaller rockets, each carrying a component of the spacecraft. We put the pieces together in orbit, and off we go.
And these two methods, these are the only ways of getting to the moon?
Yes.
Actually, there were other ideas.
Both of these methods required a huge craft with all the crew on board landing on the moon. Essentially, a craft the size of the command module then taking back off from the moon and coming straight back to Earth. The command service module of Apollo was almost double the weight of the entire lunar module, and that then doesn't include the extra rocket section that would be needed below it to descend that to the moon. Like Starship, the craft of von Braun's initial ideas was significantly larger than the lunar module, meaning a much larger rocket would be required. In fact, if you actually read what von Braun wrote that Bart is referencing to, he clearly states, quote, "It's commonly believed that men will fly directly from the Earth to the moon." The figures that he's giving here about needing a rocket taller than the Empire State Building with 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary is referring to direct ascent, not lunar orbit rendezvous. The option of lunar orbit rendezvous allowed for a much smaller craft to be used getting onto the moon, and thus a much smaller rocket needed in the first place to get it there. Think of it like you're going to drive from your house to a track, and you're going to take a vehicle with you that when you get to the track you're going to use to go around the track. If the vehicle you are going to take around the track is small and light, like a push bike, then a car would be sufficient to carry that payload to the track. But if you wanted to drive a car around the track, you would need a much larger trailer and towing vehicle in order to get there in the first place. Bart also makes some very wrong claims about the practicing that they did for landing on the moon.
Did they practice taking off on one of those things, or could they?
I don't think they
because
did.
They couldn't, right? Because it wouldn't have the same amount of thrust on Earth because the gravity is so much stronger. So that thing wouldn't have been operational on Earth, right?
Well, they had a lunar lander simulator that Neil Armstrong almost got killed in 6 weeks beforehand. He couldn't fly it on Earth in the safety of a tried and true environment, and that was 6 weeks.
Now, to answer Joe's question, the actual lunar module couldn't be used to practice with on Earth because it wasn't designed for working on Earth. It wasn't aerodynamic because it was designed for use in the vacuum of space, and it was designed for landing against 1/6 of Earth's gravity, so its engine and structure wasn't strong enough to handle landing on Earth. Although it wasn't untested. Apollo 9 extensively tested both stages of it in Earth orbit, and then Apollo 10 took it to the moon and did a power descent to within about 50,000 feet of the lunar surface before launching the ascent stage back up to meet the command module. So the only part which was new for Apollo 11 was the actual touchdown on the moon. But even if that went wrong, they had the ascent stage to get them back up again. Now, with regards to Bart's claim, yes, they made a training vehicle which was designed to try and replicate the lunar module's handling characteristics as closely as possible, given that they were dealing with an atmosphere and stronger gravity. And yes, Neil Armstrong did have an incident with one, but that was not 6 weeks before the mission, and Armstrong did have successful landings.
In 1968, Neil Armstrong prepares for his 21st flight in the Lunar Lander Trainer. The first 20 went well. But this one suffers a rare malfunction.
Armstrong's incident happened on May 6, 1968. 1 year, 2 months and 10 days before Apollo 11 lifted off. So quite where Bart gets this claim is a complete mystery. Now let's tackle his claims regarding the photos. As a professional photographer, I've done breakdowns of the Apollo lunar photos and videos before and shown how large areas of evenly lit landscapes with objects that have single, clearly defined hard shadows cannot be replicated on Earth. And despite many times of me asking, I have never had anybody be able to show me a lighting setup that can actually achieve it. But Bart claims there is evidence of electrical lighting being used.
You'll see on the left-hand side is sunlight. Try it yourself.
Right.
Go out in your front yard or your parking lot at work on a cloudless day. 2 people, 2 telephone poles, 2 trees. They will always run parallel. They will never intersect. It's impossible for sunlight shadows to intersect. And the astronaut shadow is going at 12 o'clock, and a rock 5 feet away, the shadow's going at 9 o'clock.
Bart references, though, a National Geographic video which took photos in the desert using a single electrical light, and Bart argues that this proves the Apollo photos were done using an electrical light because the shadows of it converge.
And they have people stand next to the astronaut, and the shadows intersect. And you know what they say, Joe? They say that proves that the moon missions are real. And I said, well, wait a minute. It proves that they were taken by electrical light. Why didn't you go out to a desert during the day?
The problem is that a light source close by cannot evenly light the foreground and background. The light fall off causes the ground to go dim the further away you get. The terrain in the distance is barely visible, so it is not a match to the Apollo photos. And if they then used additional lights to light up the background, you'd get multiple shadows coming off objects and all going in different directions, which we don't see. Bart seems adamant, though, that you cannot get converging shadows from the sun.
They either filmed it on the moon or they filmed it on Earth.
And that's where
if it's on the moon, the shadows are parallel in sunlight. If the shadows intersect, it's an electrical light, which means they're actually on Earth, and they're trying to fake us out.
So what you say?
It proves that they were taken by electrical light. Why didn't you go out to a desert during the day?
So I guess this desert must be being lit by an electrical light then. Reality is that the apparent direction of shadows can vary depending on the shape of the ground and perspective. Train tracks run parallel to each other, but they do appear to converge when you're looking down them. The very example that Bart shows, claiming shadows running parallel, if you actually draw the arrows correctly aligning to the shadows, rather than whatever Bart's decided to do, you can see that those shadows are appearing to converge because they're moving away from you. But in the desert example, the shadows are coming towards the camera and yet still seem to be converging, because the ground is not flat. And in the lunar photo that Bart is showing, you can tell that the surface isn't flat. And then Bart also claims that the light is behind the astronaut and then causing the shadow of the rock to come off in a different direction.
A 90-degree intersection proving that that was taken with an electrical light that's really close, and it's probably behind the astronaut, and if you go to the right of it, it's going to throw the angle off. That proves it in a court of law.
Except the direction of shadows forms a straight line from the light source through the object, which means that if this was a shadow cast by a light behind the astronaut, the shadow should actually be pointing off upwards and right, not left. Speaking of photos, Joe brings up the topic of NASA faking backgrounds in the photos. At one point, he references a photo of Michael Collins, which is often cited as evidence that NASA faked their backgrounds.
They faked a lot of photographs back then. It was pretty common. I mean, you know the famous one of the Gemini 15, where you see Michael Collins in a simulation where he's doing a drill and he's attached to wires, and then they just used the same image and blacked it out and reversed it.
The photo in question comes from the Gemini 10 mission, with a photo of Collins training in 0G, and then another photo which is clearly the same photo but flipped, and then the background has been blacked out. Joe has stated on many occasions that this is evidence that NASA are at least willing to fake the photos.
There's an image of Michael Collins from like Gemini 15 that's a very clear image of him doing a simulation, like in a studio with straps and harnesses, and then someone from NASA or someone put that exact same image, blacked out the background, and used it as a photo of a spacewalk.
The problem with this claim is that there seems to be no record of NASA ever using the edited version of this photo or claiming that it was a picture of Collins in space. They have the original training photo, even available in full color, but never the edited version. The only place the edited version seems to appear is in Michael Collins' 1974 book called Carrying the Fire, which actually uses both versions of the photo. Now, Collins did a spacewalk during the Gemini 10 mission, however, no photos of him were taken during that time because that part of the mission had the Gemini 10 craft staying near to the Agena target spacecraft but not actually docking with it. So John Young, who was the other astronaut on the mission, was too busy flying the spacecraft and so couldn't actually take any photos. It seems Collins maybe used some artistic license for his book and had a crudely edited version of the training photo as a representation for him talking about him being on a spacewalk. But he even sort of addresses the point himself in his book. And Joe then asks Bart about the claims made that the same backgrounds appear in the lunar surface photos, and that suggests that they were in a studio. Now, Bart doesn't specifically bring up any examples, but he does confirm he's seen the claims and he accepts that they're true.
Now, there's another point of contention that the same background was used in different photographs that were supposed to be nowhere near each other.
That's true. That is true.
Okay, and what's the instances of that you could show us?
Well, I don't have them queued up, but that proves that they're...
How do you not have those queued up? You must know what they are, though, right?
Well, I've seen them before. Other people have put them in films, and it's true.
Now, side note, Bart has actually shown examples of this claim in some of his other YouTube videos, and I've had a few people put forward different examples claiming this same thing previously. Except, if you don't take the claim at face value, and instead go and find the original scans on the likes of March to the Moon, every single time I have found that the photos in the claim don't match the original scans. The people making the claim keep having to distort one of the photos to force the backgrounds to line up, aka lying. Not only do the backgrounds change, but there were many 360-degree sequences of photos which were taken that you can stitch together into panoramas and can clearly see no signs of any studios there. There was even at least one 360-degree video from the rover on Apollo 17. It starts facing the Lunar Module, rotates roughly 180 degrees to the right to view the astronauts posing with the flag, whilst the astronauts were taking photos facing back towards the rover, after which the camera carries on turning to the right all the way back round to the Lunar Module, and again, no sign of any studio. Which ties us nicely to some areas where Bart heavily contradicts himself. When Joe questions him about the sheer number of people that would have to be involved in such a cover-up, Bart on several occasions tries to undersell it by arguing that only 3 people would need to know it was faked.
At the peak, Apollo program employed 400,000 people and required the support of over 20,000 industrial firms and universities.
Eugene Krantz, flight director, he said that a person in the command center in Houston during a launch to the moon can tell no difference whatsoever between a computer-simulated flight and a real flight. Once the rocket is up, there's only 3 eyewitnesses to it. It's actually much easier to fake.
So this is Bart trying to argue that the astronauts would be the only people that needed to know it was faked because they were the ones staying in low Earth orbit, and that everyone else on the ground, it would just still appear as though they had gone to the moon. Even the people in mission control apparently couldn't tell the difference between a real mission and a simulation. Well, that for starters is a wild claim. Sure, simulations are made to feel as real as possible to everyone involved, but when controllers are going through simulations, they are dealing in real time with the astronauts, who are also in the simulation, instructing them on what to do to rectify problems. If the controllers thought that the astronauts were descending to the moon when the astronauts were in fact still in low Earth orbit, The controllers must have been handling a simulated landing, yet were speaking live to the astronauts who, at the same time, were not in a simulation of any landing.
Flight fighter, GTC is right on nominal.
Roger, GTC nominal. In the AC voltage now. Roger. 50 meter maybe, huh?
It's okay, flight.
Stand by.
Okay.
It's looking good to us. You're still looking good. It's coming up 3 minutes.
The astronauts couldn't have known any of the telemetry information that the controllers were seeing, and yet they were able to read it out perfectly. And Apollo 11, quite famously, had quite a big potential problem during the descent when what turned out to be an onboard radar turned on unexpectedly and overloaded the computer and caused a 1201 and 1202 warnings to start sounding.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go, flight.
Okay, we're go. We're go. Same type, we're go.
This was not something that they had trained for prior to the mission. The programmers at NASA, who'd written all of the guidance computer coding, knew nothing of what was going on. They were on the ground at the time, frantically trying to figure out the problem, and couldn't.
1202 alarm. 1202. Standing by.
The computer's display was flashing error codes 1201 and 1202, but the astronauts didn't know what those alarms meant. Not even the programmers who designed it were sure just what was happening.
Right here you see the 1201 and 1202 codes. There was a pit of the stomach feeling. If it had been up to me, I probably would have recommended an abort.
But flight controllers in Houston had a better perspective. Soon after the alarms started, Mission Control realized that the computer was still running the critical guidance and navigation systems.
The controllers pressed ahead with the landing anyway, but Neil and Buzz were calling out these error codes before the controllers were mentioning them, which could have only have happened if they were experiencing it at the same time. But even then, not only would the 3 astronauts know that the mission was faked, whoever was in mission control running the simulations through their systems at the exact moment that the whole world was watching what they thought was humans landing on the moon, they must have all known that it was fake as well. People at the top levels of NASA must have made the call to fake the landings. It's not like Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins just went up in a rocket and then thought, nah, I can't be arsed going to the moon, let's just pretend we went. I mean, Bart himself refers to an apparent eyewitness to them faking the landings, a guard at a US Air Force base, which claimed that they were there when the thing was being faked in a hangar.
As you know from my book, we have an eyewitness who saw them film Apollo 11 at Cannon Air Force Base, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1968. And
yeah, but I have eyewitnesses that were raped by Bigfoot. You can find those.
Well,
you know what I'm saying? Like, if the guy wasn't here,
his son corroborates it, and we have a video of that we can show.
Now, in reality, his evidence is not first-hand eyewitness account.
I don't want any money for what I'm doing because hopefully this video won't come out until after my death. My father, in 1968, was stationed at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. So these notes were made a long time ago. The original recording that my father made on his deathbed was destroyed in a fire.
It's a man claiming that his father was the eyewitness, that the father on their deathbed then recorded a confession video which was left to the son. The son then lost the video years later in a house fire, then decided to wait until he himself was dying to record a confession about the confession video, which he then left to Bart and was not publicly released until after the guy had passed away. Which strikes me as odd on several points. I mean, personally, if I was given such a history-changing thing as an eyewitness account of humanity's greatest achievements being a lie, I might be inclined to make some copies of it to avoid the possibility of losing it. Then I can kind of buy why the guard would not want to say anything until they were dying, but it seems strange that the son would then wait as well. Either way, the point is that Bart is claiming that the only people that would need to know it was faked would be the 3 astronauts, but then he claims to have eyewitness accounts from people who saw it being faked at the time, Which makes sense, because for it to be faked on an Air Force base and only have 3 astronauts as eyewitnesses would mean that those 3 would have to sneak into the base, set up an entire moon studio, shoot hundreds of photos, pack it all down, and get out again without anybody noticing. For Bart's claim to be true, the personnel on the Air Force base would have had to have known about it. They would have had to have had people brought in to set up the studio and set up all of the lighting. Not to mention that Bart himself claims that they faked it in low Earth orbit and that there were people on the ground prompting the astronauts on what to do, and that the astronauts had done TV broadcasts to practice faking it all. So the people picking up the transmissions, the video feeds, and doing the prompting would have also had to know as well. Not to mention, Apollo was tracked by tracking stations around the world, who needed to point their tracking antennas towards Apollo to pick up the transmissions. Well, those people must have surely have noticed that it was strange they couldn't get any transmissions whilst aiming their antennas at the moon, and instead were just picking up short bursts of transmissions that kept moving, which is what would have happened if they were actually in low Earth orbit at the time. He also brings up another person called Bill Kaysing, who worked for RocketDyne, the company that built the Saturn V engines.
And then I'm 14 years old, and I see Bill Kaysing, a former RocketDyne employee who worked for NASA for 6 years on the Apollo program with high security clearance, only second to von Braun, who says, look, I edited a memo from von Braun to the Pentagon warning them they are not going to make the goal. There's only a 1 in 10,000 chance they can go to the moon on the first attempt.
And what year was this?
That was back in 1966, I think.
Now, for starters, Bart bigs Kaysing up here as, quote, second only to von Braun, and stating that Kaysing edited a memo from von Braun to the Pentagon in 1966, which doesn't seem close to accurate. The Bill Kaysing Tribute website mentions that he was a technical writer for RocketDyne. Quite why a technical writer for a contractor in Los Angeles would be editing a memo between the head of NASA and the Pentagon, both of which are on the opposite side of the country, is anybody's guess. But the website also states that he worked for RocketDyne for several years before he then quit his job, sold his house, and moved. It gives no specific dates, however, the website also includes an interview with Bill's daughter Wendy, who stated that they lived in Topanga, California, whilst his father worked at RocketDyne, but they then moved to Seattle in 1962, before moving then again to Santa Barbara in 1963, and that at that time Bill was then working as a marketing executive for dental products. Which doesn't seem to fit Bart's timeline at all. I mean, he left RocketDyne early in the Apollo program and several years before the memo that Bart claims, and it makes no sense why such a classified memo would be openly handed to a frankly fairly minor position within a company that was just one of the contractors building a part of the Saturn V. Because whilst the Saturn V was designed by NASA, it was built by many different companies, including Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, IBM, RocketDyne, Grumman, North American Aviation, and many more. So if a technical writer with seemingly no actual expertise in rocketry could work out that the Saturn V couldn't have made it to the moon, and that there were apparently these memos flying around saying that it couldn't be done, there must have been many more amongst the 400,000 people working on the Saturn V that would have also known that it couldn't have got there. And all of this faking is just Apollo 11 he's talking about. Apollos 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all went to the moon as well. In total, 24 astronauts flew to the moon, not 3. And it's unlikely those 24 did not let on to their families that things were not what they seemed. So there would have been far more than just 3 people who would have known about this conspiracy taking place. And speaking of astronauts telling things to their loved ones, this brings us up to Bart talking about Gus Grissom.
I interviewed the widow of Gus Grissom.
Now, we should explain one of the things that Gus Grissom did that got people very angry. He hung a lemon.
That's right.
Yeah, explain that.
Well, basically, he was totally confused how they could possibly think they're going to the moon in 2 years. He thought it was at least 10 years away.
Right.
And in his fury, without permission, he held a press conference. He invited in a bunch of reporters to the top of the rocket where he affixed a lemon the size of a grapefruit on a coat hanger. He said, this thing is a lemon, a piece of junk, made the evening news. And he was preparing reports to give to Congress and the Senate that his wife told me were confiscated from his house by CIA agents before they even informed her that he was dead.
Grissom was indeed a well-regarded astronaut. He'd flown the second manned Mercury mission, the first Gemini mission, he was going to fly the first Apollo mission, and was being earmarked to command the first moon landing mission, which would have made him the first person to walk on the moon. Tragically, though, Gus was killed along with the other members of the Apollo 1 crew, Ed White and Roger Chaffee, in a fire inside the capsule during one of the flight tests in January 1967. And Gus did indeed hang a lemon on it, although it said that it was hung on the simulator, not the actual rocket. And the photos taken seem to confirm this, as the hatch has no window on it, yet the Apollo 1 hatch did. And Gus made no secret that they were having lots of problems with Apollo, stating to one reporter that the problems on Apollo 1 came in, quote, bushelsfuls. And he was skeptical whether the Apollo 1 mission could manage to last the full planned 14 days. However, there's zero record of any press conference regarding this lemon, and a brand new rocket having problems which need to be overcome is hardly a bloody surprise. It's still happening to this day. In 1966, the Phillips report was published by NASA, which went into great detail highlighting issues with North American aviation, who were building both the S2 stage and the Command Service Module, proposing pushbacks in the schedules, including moving the first crewed launch from AS-203 to AS-204, and that 204 was unlikely to be ready for October 1966. AS-204 was the original coding for the Apollo 1 mission, which ultimately wasn't going to be launched until February 1967, so it's already widely known that the Apollo program was suffering delays. And yet, Bart makes several claims surrounding the circumstances of the Apollo 1 fire being caused to seemingly silence Gus's doubts.
They weren't launching anything. It was just a ground test of pressing buttons. And they found that they pressurized that space capsule with 100% oxygen, where steel will become flammable. They reversed the door the day before so that it opened inwardly instead of outwardly. And then they found a pile of oily rags under his seat. They rigged it with the oily rags under there, with reversing the. They did everything they could to make sure those guys burned alive. Because Gus Grissom, had they asked him to fake the moon landing, he would have said no way, and then he would have gone to the reporters.
Yes, pure oxygen was used in the cabin, but it was not a last-minute introduction to Apollo 1.
They knew not to do that. It had caused fatalities.
Where did you hear this fact?
Well, she told me, and it's in the Apollo 1 report, which
so
I read.
in the Apollo 1 report, it says that they increased the oxygen by how much?
Well, they did 100% oxygen in the cabin.
And did they say why?
They was just testing it. Something to test, an experiment.
A pure oxygen atmosphere had been used without issue in all 16 Mercury and Gemini missions.
The first sneeze in space has been accredited to Gemini 7. Frank Borman sneezed a couple of times on Wednesday night. The only problem they really had up there is breathing this pure 100% oxygen. Their nasal and throat passages have dried out, which was somewhat expected.
Because in space, the oxygen was only at 5 psi, so fires wouldn't really behave any differently than ones on Earth. But it did offer benefits. The craft didn't need to carry around tanks of nitrogen, which saved on weight, and the craft also then only had to withstand a 5 psi pressure difference between inside and outside, rather than a 14 psi difference that there would have been if they'd used a mixed gas atmosphere. On the ground, the cabin was pressurized to 16 psi of pure oxygen. This was done to force any nitrogen out of the cabin and thus avoid any potential decompression sickness. And here's a video taken by the astronauts during one of the earlier training missions, said to be May 1966. And during this, they referenced the use of pure oxygen in the cabin. And this is around 8 months before the fire.
GSTC.
What is our concentration now, oxygen?
99% and verified by GA.
Commander, would you close the O2 metering valve now?
It's closed.
So the use of pure oxygen was nothing new. Bart's claiming that there were oily rags left under the seat, but I can find absolutely no evidence to support that claim. Bart also makes a very serious claim regarding the hatch design.
They reversed the door the day before so that it opened inwardly instead of outwardly. Took an extra 5 or 10 minutes to open up them.
Is there a logical explanation for why they reversed the doors?
Yeah, so they would make sure not to be able to get out. It would take more time to get out.
But is that?
They would kill them.
But is there a logical explanation in terms of an improvement in design for use in space?
They were just testing something new, right? That's their excuse.
This is outright rubbish. The Block 1 design command module, as used on Apollo 1, had 2 panels to it. The outer panel opened outwards, but the inner panel opened inwards. Opening outwards when you have more pressure inside the cabin than outside puts a constant force trying to push the hatch open, and so requires a much more substantial locking mechanism to ensure it stays secure. An inward opening hatch doesn't need as complex a locking system because the cabin pressure would be keeping the hatch push sealed. It's why aeroplane doors open inwards before they swing outwards, because at high altitudes you can't then accidentally open them. But Bart's notion that they changed the hatch design the day before is laughable. For starters, North American themselves would have needed to have come in to do it. Secondly, if the hatch was originally designed to open outwards, you wouldn't need 2 panels. In fact, that would be more dangerous for the crew because they could never have opened the inner hatch until the outer hatch had actually been removed. I mean, just try putting 2 front doors on your house that both open outwards and see how easy it is for you to go outside. Here's a photo of the inner hatch in place, and the bolts are locking from the inside outwards. Here's a photo of the Apollo 1 crew during an earlier training simulation, and you can see the hatch above them with the handles on the inside. So that hatch was always opening inwards, but even if it wasn't, you can't just change the direction of a hatch in one day. The inner hatch was designed to butt up to the hull and lock into place. Note how it is flush with the inside of the capture wall, meaning there had to have been a recess already built into the hull for the hatch to sit in. If the hatch had originally been designed to open outwards, it would have been on the other side of the recess. Bart's claims that they drastically altered the command module last minute are utter tripe, although he does also argue that Gus's wife and son seemingly both argue that he was murdered as well.
Right, he died in a fire, correct?
His wife says that fire was set intentionally.
I understand that she says
her.
that. I understand that, and I understand that why she would believe that. That makes sense.
Well, if her husband says CIA agents are messing around with the equipment the day before, and he's dead the next day from faulty equipment, the CIA killed him. It's a pretty obvious conclusion.
Now, I've not seen any such interviews conducted by Bart, but I have heard what is said to be Gus's son Scott.
I think it was intentionally sabotaged by someone. It's been a question in my mind, what was found in the accident investigation and how was that handled? Was the CIA involved or whoever? But it was done intentionally.
Gus gave his life for this program, and I feel like that it is up to NASA to come forward and give us a direct answer to what really happened.
What seems strange from this, though, is that Betty Grissom sued a few years after the incident, but it seems that she only sued with the grounds of negligence causing the fire rather than murder. She co-authored a book about Gus and the family called Starfall, which was published in 1974. Copies of this are rare and expensive now, but the reviews of the book from people who own it don't seem to make any suggestion of there being any claims of a conspiracy. So if this is genuinely Betty and Scott Grissom making these claims, they're fairly recent that they've come about this mindset. And yet, Bart says she'd claimed conversations with Gus talking about the CIA being around the rocket the day before the launch.
And he was preparing reports to give to Congress and the Senate that his wife told me were confiscated from his house by CIA agents before they even informed her that he was dead, which his wife told me that on January 26, 1967, he came home from work and said the following: "Hon, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today. I wonder why they're here inspecting the equipment. Never seen him here before." He's dead the very next day from faulty equipment. His widow told me he was murdered by the CIA.
Which doesn't add up. And from what I've seen, Scott Grissom's claims are that NASA killed his father because they didn't want him being the first man on the moon, not that they couldn't get to the moon. And Bart's claiming that Gus was killed because Gus was speaking ill of the Apollo project and that he didn't think they would hit the deadline.
They rigged it with the oily rags under there, with reversing they did everything they could to make sure those guys burned alive. Because Gus Grissom, had they asked him to fake the moon landing, he would have said no way, and then he would have gone to the reporters.
Well, as I've already shown with the Phillips report, NASA themselves were just as damning to their own project as Gus was. The Phillips report was conducted by a team of people, which was headed up by Lieutenant General Samuel Phillips, who was the director of the Apollo program at the time. And this report was done in November and December of 1965. At this point, Gus Grissom hadn't even been selected for the Apollo 1 crew. The Apollo 1 crew didn't get announced until several months later, on March 21st, 1966. So killing him for that seems a bit overboard. And if they didn't want him to be the first man on the moon, they could have just arranged the crew rotations so that he wouldn't have been. All of these claims center around killing Gus, and for reasons very specific to him. So why kill Ed White and Roger Chaffee? All three of them could not have been the first on the moon. Neither of the other two seemed to have anything negative to say publicly about the project. Chaffee hadn't even been in space at that point. If NASA wanted Gus specifically to be out of the way, then why not just do something specifically to him? Moreover, if Bart is correct and NASA wanted Gus gone because he was talking publicly about how they weren't going to meet the deadline, intentionally causing the Apollo 1 fire seems like the dumbest solution to it. Because that fire resulted in the only outcome that was ever going to happen: the complete grounding of the entire Apollo project and an in-depth investigation, which led subsequently to an extensive redesign of many aspects of the command module, and overall an 18-month delay to the program was caused. A program that was already suffering from delays. Every single NASA mission had backup crews that trained for that same mission at the same time alongside the prime crew for just such an event. The original Gemini 9 crew of Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett died in a plane crash, so the backup crew of Stafford and Cernan flew instead. Famously, on Apollo 13, Ken Mattingly was grounded last minute and replaced by Jack Swigert. So surely the more logical solution for this conspiracy would have been to just get Gus out of the equation, away from the mission, and fly Apollo 1 with the backup crew and thus not cause any further delays. Now, let's cover the post-flight press conference, another favourite of conspiracy theorists, and Bart brings this up and talks about how awkward Armstrong appears and how he's talking like it sounds like he's prompted.
But it's the tone in which Neil Armstrong takes.
It's our privilege today to share with you some of the details of that final month of July.
One interesting thing to note there, you see the two teleprompters there in the desk? These are the only guys on Earth who know what it was like to walk on the moon, and yet they're being prompted on how to answer the questions.
The problem with drawing any analysis of this situation is you need to compare it to how a person normally reacts. It's why lie detector tests ask control questions, because everybody behaves differently in situations, so they need to see how you usually respond to telling the truth to see if you then behave differently to other questions. Well, from all accounts, Armstrong was quite a shy and reserved person anyway. So, thrown into a room full of reporters, after becoming essentially one of the most famous people in the whole of history, is bound to be unnerving. However, for comparison, here is Armstrong in the post-flight press conference after the Gemini 8 mission.
The launch of two successful on-time vehicles was, of course, very reassuring to us. Our flight plan was a relatively complicated one, and it depended very much on the launch of both vehicles occurring very precisely on time.
To me, his mannerisms don't seem any different than with the Apollo 11 press conference. But looking into earlier questions in the press conference, you can see that they're quite relaxed.
Complete answer. How do you propose to restore some normalcy to your private lives in the years ahead?
I wish I knew the answer to the latter part of your question.
It kind of depends on you.
Was there ever a moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
Sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point.
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We'd been orbiting around the moon for quite a while.
Another odd thing was that Michael Collins said that he couldn't see stars, but yet he wrote in his 1994 book about how magnificent the stars looked.
And
also, he never left the lunar orbiter.
That's right. And also, when he's asked about stars, Neil Armstrong says, "I don't recall." And then Michael Collins, to fill in for him, to help him out, says, "I don't remember seeing any."
Yeah.
Which he wasn't there.
For this, it's important to understand the context of the question that's being asked. Patrick Moore asked two questions at once.
I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may. When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
The first question was related specifically to the surface of the moon, which Aldrin answered.
In rather flat regions, the footprint would penetrate perhaps a half an inch or sometimes only a quarter of an inch and gave a very firm response. In other regions near the edges of these craters, we could find that the foot would sink down maybe 2, 3, possibly 4 inches. And in the slope, of course, the various edges of the footprint might go on up to 6 or 7 inches, and compacting this material would tend to produce a slight sideways motion as it was compacted on the material underneath it. So we feel that you cannot always tell just by looking at the terrain what the exact resistance will be as your foot sinks into a point of firm contact. So one must be quite cautious in moving around in this rough terrain.
The second question was asking if they could see any stars in the solar corona.
Could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
The solar corona is the outermost part of the sun's atmosphere, and we only usually see it during an eclipse. Well, earlier in the press conference, the astronauts actually talked about how, as they neared the moon, they passed into the moon's shadow, meaning the moon was eclipsing the sun, and they were able to see the solar corona and took photos of it.
During our flight to the moon, we flew through the moon's shadow. In fact, the moon was eclipsing the sun, and we took the opportunity to try to take some photographs of it, but our film was just not sufficiently fast to capture the event.
So it seems Patrick Moore was asking about could they see stars in the corona during that time.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Which would make Collins's response perfectly reasonable because all three astronauts were together at that moment. Bart also then brings up some of the usual favourites like the petrified wood incident.
Neil Armstrong said he personally picked up a particular rock, put it in his pocket, and saved it for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And they put it in a hermetically sealed box.
Yeah.
The curator saw my film, says, oh, I wonder about that. He opens it up, puts the rock under a microscope, and it's petrified wood.
You would say, what was the chain of custody?
Personally gave it to him, and he said, I picked this up off the surface of the moon. Here you go. They put it in a box. That's not much chain of command to get messed up.
All the reports that I've seen of this don't say it was Armstrong that presented it. Rather, they say it was the US Ambassador J. William Middendorf who gave it to the then former Dutch Prime Minister William de Vries. De Vries passed away in 1988, following which the object was given to the museum, who seemingly vetted it by calling NASA and asking, could it be a moon rock? To which NASA's response was, it could be. So for as much as Bart's claims go, there seems to be only his word that Armstrong decided to pick up a moon rock and hand it to a former Dutch minister who hadn't been in office for more than a decade. And the thing was under de Vries' possession for more than 20 years before it found its way into a museum who seemingly presumed it was a moon rock just because NASA said it might be. For all we know, Middendorf might have picked it up thinking it was a moon rock and presented it in good conscience thinking it was a moon rock. It could well be that it was lost in translation, that he knowingly gave a piece of petrified wood that de Vries mistook for moon rock. Given that it only went to the museum after de Vries had died, someone had taken hold of de Vries' possessions to then give to the museum. Maybe they mistook a piece of petrified wood and thought it was a piece of moon rock. Or maybe the museum just mistakenly presumed it was moon rock. In reality, hundreds of moon rock samples were presented to countries all around the world, except all of the official ones which were given were properly presented on a plaque, not just randomly handed to people. 2 rocks were in fact officially presented to the Netherlands, both of which, though, are stored in a different museum. And it seems odd that news would break that this apparent moon rock sample turned out to be petrified wood, and seemingly none of the other museums around the world have bothered to check theirs. Bart then throws in the great, they destroyed all the data, the designs, the telemetry, etc., etc., which is a massive over-exaggeration.
This is one reason why NASA destroyed all the schematics, all the electronics, all the diagrams of the equipment. They didn't have that much actual footage. I don't think they would have a problem saying, well, we just, destroyed the pictures. All we have is a TV image.
It is really crazy that they destroyed all the original footage.
The original designs are all still around. They're stored on microfilm at NASA. I've actually even seen auctions that were held selling original pages of the blueprints of the Lunar Module directly from Grumman engineers. Hilariously, I've even seen other moon landing deniers claiming that they'd rebuilt full-size replicas of the Lunar Module exactly to specification to try and argue that it wasn't big enough for 2 people. With regards to the telemetry tapes, bear in mind with this, all these missions were between 8 to 12 days long. Throughout that time, Houston was receiving a constant 24/7 stream of tracking data about the crafts from tracking stations. At the same time, they were having all of the data from the spacecraft about how every single system was functioning. Health monitors on the crew, continuous radio chatter back and forth, any video transmissions that were being made. All of that data was being recorded by Houston onto data tapes. So there was a hell of a lot of data that Houston was saving from each mission. Now, quite famously, a few years back, they went looking for the original tapes from Apollo 11 to see if they could enhance the broadcast footage from the lunar surface, but they couldn't find it. They ultimately reached the conclusion that it must have been accidentally recorded over several years prior when NASA was suffering from a shortage of tapes and they needed them for other projects. And so people claim that, well, they must have intentionally scrubbed the tapes and wiped all of the data. Which makes no sense. Almost all of the data tapes which were recorded were not being recorded for sentiment. They were for engineers to see how the equipment was performing and see what things could be improved, like trying to work out the cause of the 1201 alarms that Apollo 11 had during descent. Once all of that data was examined, it was essentially surplus to requirement. but all of it was examined and documented. There are extensive reports which went over many areas of each mission in detail. The one for Apollo 11 is 348 pages long and actually includes lots of pieces of telemetry data. But if they had wiped all the videos, there wouldn't be any videos from Apollo 11. Now, the only known broadcast footage from the moon is duplicates of the original broadcast.
This, what you're looking at, is not a direct feed that was offered to the news organizations.
They put it on a big screen. You got to understand 1969 projection technology, very low resolution.
Looks like this.
Then they put a camera on it. They ran that to a monitor, and then they had people film the monitor.
Right.
So it was deliberately fourth generation. So they're intentionally degrading the quality of the signal. The networks wanted a live feed, and they gave them fourth generation instead.
Because TV stations couldn't access the original feed. The camera that was recording that footage on the moon was a slow scan feed, which TV stations couldn't decode. But the entire 2-hour-plus moonwalk footage is on YouTube for everyone to see. All the broadcast footage from on board the craft is still there. Bart himself has used those tapes in his own arguments before.
Right-hand side are the outtakes that we got an unedited reel of the special effects shot by accident.
All the high-quality 16mm film, which wasn't broadcast directly back to Earth, and instead was recorded onto tapes in the camera and returned to Earth with the crew, is all still available. Like the camera which recorded the descent out of the window, and also recorded both Armstrong and later Aldrin on the moon before the film ran out. We can still see all of the original broadcast footage from later missions, such as the many hours of footage from the rover cameras on Apollos 15 through 17. In fact, a significantly improved colour version of the camera was ready in time for the Apollo 12 mission, and it was able to record the initial part of the EVA as they came down the ladder. Unfortunately, as Al Bean moved it to set it up away from the Lunar Module, he inadvertently pointed it towards the sun and burnt the thing out. Which you'd struggle to do with electrical lighting in a studio anyway, but surely even if they did and they were faking all of this ahead of time, they'd have reshot the footage with a new camera. So if they were trying to hide faking the moon landings, why didn't they lose all of the tapes from every mission? Such as this 16mm film, which was recorded out of one of the windows whilst orbiting the moon, viewing the Earth, clearly not on the other side of the spacecraft and looking out of a small circular window, and we can even see reflections of the spacesuit as well. They are not faking that in low Earth orbit. Which actually brings us nicely full circle back to where we started, and I think is probably enough to highlight the misinformation which Bart constantly spouts. I doubt this will persuade him to stop, but ultimately, like I said, this is not about persuading him, rather it's about correcting him for the benefit of everybody else. And with that, that's going to draw this video to a close. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.